Number 6. The rebuttal evidence. Is the Jesus of history the same as the Jesus of faith? It happens all the time on television dramas and in paperback novels, but it's extremely rare in real-life legal dramas. So when an eyewitness in a murder trial refused to point out the defendant as the slayer, and instead confessed that he was the killer, the entire courtroom was stunned, and I had an amazing story for the Chicago Tribune. Richard Moss was accused of shooting a 19-year-old Chicagoan to death outside a Northwest Side tavern. Moss's longtime friend, Ed Passeri, was called to the witness stand to describe the altercation that led to the slaying. Passeri painted the scene that occurred outside the Rusty Nail pub, and then the defense attorney asked him what happened to the victim. Without blinking, Passeri replied that after the victim stabbed him with a pair of scissors, I shot him. The court transcriber's jaw dropped open. Prosecutors threw up their hands. The judge immediately halted the proceedings to advise Passeri of his constitutional right against self-incrimination. And then the defendant got on the stand and said, yes, that's right. It was Passeri who committed the crime. What Passeri did by confessing was an act of raw courage, crowed the defense attorney. But prosecutors were unconvinced. What courage? Asked one of them. Passeri knows he's not running the risk of prosecution because the only evidence the state has points to Richard Moss. Still overwhelmingly persuaded of Moss's guilt, prosecutors knew they had to present strong testimony to controvert Passeri's claim. In legal terminology, what they needed was rebuttal evidence, defined as any proof that's offered to explain, counteract, or disprove a witness's account. The next day, prosecutors questioned 3 other eyewitnesses who said there was no doubt that it was Moss who had committed the slaying. Sure enough, based on this and other evidence, the jurors found Moss guilty. Prosecutors did the right thing. When the overpowering strength of the evidence clearly pointed toward the guilt of the defendant, they were wise to be skeptical of an essentially unsupported assertion made by someone with a vested interest in helping his friend. How does this legal concept of rebuttal evidence fit into my investigation of Jesus? Now that I had heard powerfully convincing and well-reasoned evidence from the scholars I questioned for this book, I needed to turn my attention to the decidedly contrary opinions of a small group of academics who have been the subject of a whirlwind of news coverage. I'm sure you've seen the articles. In recent years, the news media have been saturated with uncritical reports about the Jesus Seminar, a self-selected group that represents a minuscule percentage of New Testament scholars, but that generates coverage vastly out of proportion to the group's influence. The seminar's publicity-savvy participants attracted the press by voting with colored beads on whether they thought Jesus said what the Gospels quoted him as saying. A red bead meant Jesus undoubtedly said this or something like it. A pink bead meant he probably said it. A gray bead meant he didn't say it, but the ideas are similar to his own. And a black bead meant he didn't utter these words at all. In the end, they concluded that Jesus did not say 82% of what the Gospels attribute to him. Most of the remaining 18% was considered somewhat doubtful, with only 2% of Jesus' sayings confidently determined to be authentic. Craving controversy and lacking the expertise to scrutinize the seminar's methodology, journalists devoted fountains of ink to the story. Then the seminar published the 5 Gospels, containing the 4 traditional Gospels plus the questionable Gospel of Thomas, with Jesus' words color-coded to match the group's findings. Flip through it and you'll find expanses of black type, but precious little in red. For example, the only words in the Lord's Prayer that the seminar is convinced Jesus said are, "Our Father." But I wanted to go beyond the headlines and to unearth the rest of the story. I needed to know if there was any credible rebuttal evidence to refute these troubling and widely publicized opinions. Were the Jesus Seminar's findings solidly based on unbiased scholarly research? Or were they like Passeri's ill-fated testimony, well-meaning but ultimately unsupported? For answers, I made the 6-hour drive to St. Paul, Minnesota, to confer with Dr. Gregory Boyd, the Ivy League-educated theology professor whose books and articles have challenged the Jesus Seminar head-on. The fifth interview. Gregory A. Boyd, Ph.D. Boyd first clashed with the Jesus Seminar in 1996 when he wrote a devastating critique of liberal perspectives of Jesus called Cynic, Sage, or Son of God, Recovering the Real Jesus in an Age of Revisionist Replies. The heavily footnoted 416-page tome was honored by readers of Christianity Today as one of their favorite books of the year. His popular paperback, Jesus Under Siege, continues the same themes on a more introductory level. Boyd's other books include the award-winning Letters from a Skeptic, in which he and his then-doubting father wrestle through tough issues involving Christianity, culminating in his father becoming a committed Christian, and God at War, The Bible and Spiritual Conflict. He also co-authored The Jesus Legend, a case for the historical reliability of the synoptic Jesus tradition. In addition, he was a contributing scholar to the Quest Study Bible, which was designed for people who are asking intellectual questions about the Christian faith. After receiving a bachelor's degree in philosophy from the University of Minnesota, Boyd earned a Master of Divinity degree, cum laude, from Yale University Divinity School, and a doctorate, magna cum laude, from Princeton Theological Seminary. He is not, however, a stereotypical ivory tower intellectual. With wavy black hair, a wiry frame, and a wry smile, Boyd looks like the academic counterpart of comedian Howie Mandel. And like Mandel, he is pure kinetic energy. Words gush from him like water from a ruptured pipe. He spins out sophisticated ideas and theological concepts at a dizzying rate. He fidgets, he gestures, he squirms in his chair. There's no time to tuck in his shirt all the way, to file the flurry of papers strewn about his office, or to shelve the books that sit in untidy stacks on his floor. He's too busy thinking, debating, questioning, wondering, dreaming, contemplating, inventing, and tackling one project after another. In fact, one career can't contain him. In addition to his position as adjunct professor of theology at Bethel University, he's also a pastor at Woodland Hills Church, where his passionate preaching has helped attendance grow from 42 in 1992 to 2,500 today. This real-world environment helps anchor him in the reality of everyday life. For fun, he debates atheists. He grappled with the late Gordon Stein on the topic, Does God Exist? He and pastor-turned-skeptic Dan Barker sparred over, Did Jesus rise from the dead? And in a program sponsored by the Islamic Center of Minnesota, he challenged a Muslim on the issue, Is God a Trinity? Boyd's agile mind, quick wit, empathy with people, and deep reservoir of biblical and philosophical knowledge make him a formidable foe. What's more, he blends popular culture and serious scholarship as well as anyone I know. He knows football as well as footnotes. He can start a sentence with an offhand observation about a new movie and end it with a stratospheric reference to a profound philosophical conundrum. He's as comfortable reading a current comic strip or watching a trendy sitcom as he is writing his impressive book, Trinity and Process, a critical evaluation and reconstruction of Hartshorne's dipolar theism towards a Trinitarian metaphysics. His casual and colloquial style, what other biblical scholar gets away with words like funky and wacko, quickly made me feel at home as we squeezed into his second-floor office. It was soon clear that Boyd was wound up and ready to go. I decided to start from the perspective of the average consumer of news. People pick up a magazine or newspaper, read the conclusions of the Jesus Seminar, and assume that this represents the mainstream of New Testament scholarship, I said. But is that really the case? No, he said. looking as if he had just bitten into something sour. No, that's not the case. But you're right, people get that impression. He rocked in his chair until he got comfortable enough to tell a story. When Time came out with its first major article on the Jesus Seminar, he said, I happened to be in the process of talking about Christianity with a guy whom I was building a relationship with. He was very skeptical by nature and quite inebriated with New Age ideas. We had a mutual friend who was hospitalized, and when I went to visit him, this other guy was already there, reading Time. As I walked into the room, he said to me, Well, Greg, it looks like the scholars disagree with you. And he threw the magazine at me. Boyd shook his head in both sadness and disbelief. You see, that article gave him the reason to stop taking me seriously. Even though he knew I was a scholar, he interpreted this article as saying that the majority of scholars, at least those who aren't wacko fundamentalists, hold these views. I could empathize with Boyd's story, having heard too many people equate the Jesus Seminar with all scholars. Do you think that impression is an accident? I asked. Well, the Jesus Seminar certainly portrays itself that way, Boyd replied. In fact, this is one of its most irritating facets, not just to evangelicals, but to other scholars as well. If you look at their book, The Five Gospels, they give 7 pillars of scholarly wisdom, as if you must follow their methodology if you're going to be a true scholar. But a lot of scholars, from a wide spectrum of backgrounds, would have serious reservations about one or even most of these pillars. And the Jesus Seminar calls its translation of the Bible the Scholar's Version. Well, what does that imply? That other versions aren't scholarly? He paused for a moment, then cut to the core of the issue. Here's the truth, he said. The Jesus Seminar represents an extremely small number of radical fringe scholars who are on the far, far left wing of New Testament thinking. It does not represent mainstream scholarship. And ironically, they have their own brand of fundamentalism. They say they have the right way of doing things, period. He smiled. In the name of diversity, he added with a chuckle, they can actually be quite narrow. At least, I said, the participants in the Jesus Seminar have been very upfront about their goals, haven't they? Yes, that's right. They're explicit in saying they want to rescue the Bible from fundamentalism and to free Americans from the naive belief that the Jesus of the Bible is the real Jesus. They say they want a Jesus who's relevant for today. One of them said that the traditional Jesus did not speak to the needs of the ecological crisis, the nuclear crisis, the feminist crisis, so we need a new picture of Jesus. As another one said, we need a new fiction. One of the twists is that they're going directly to the masses instead of to other scholars. They want to take their findings out of the ivory tower and bring them into the marketplace to influence popular opinion. And what they have in mind is a totally new form of Christianity. The idea of a new Jesus, a new faith, a new Christianity was intriguing. So tell me about this Jesus that people from the Jesus Seminar have discovered, I said. What's he like? Basically, they discovered what they set out to find. Some think he was a political revolutionary, some a religious fanatic, some a wonder worker, some a feminist, some an egalitarian, some a subversive. There's a lot of diversity, he said. Then he zeroed in on the key issue. But there is one picture that they all agree with. Jesus, first of all, must be a naturalistic Jesus. In other words, whatever else is said about him, Jesus was a man like you or me. Maybe he was an extraordinary man. Maybe he tapped into our inherent potential as no one else ever has, but he was not supernatural. So they say Jesus and his early followers didn't see him as God or the Messiah, and they didn't see his death as having any special significance. His crucifixion was unfortunate and untimely, and stories about his resurrection came later as a way of trying to deal with that sad reality. I stood and strolled over to his bookshelf as I formulated my next question. Okay, but you personally have faith that Jesus was resurrected, and maybe your faith taints your viewpoint too much, I said. The Jesus Seminar paints itself as being on an unbiased quest for truth, as compared with religiously committed people like you, who have a theological agenda. Boyd turned in his seat to face me. But that's not what's really going on, he insisted. The participants of the Jesus Seminar are at least as biased as evangelicals, and I would say more so. They bring a whole set of assumptions to their scholarship, which of course we all do to some degree. Their major assumption, which incidentally is not the product of unbiased scholarly research, is that the Gospels are not even generally reliable. They conclude this at the outset because the Gospels include things that seem historically unlikely, like miracles, walking on water, raising the dead. These things, they say, just don't happen. That's naturalism, which says that for every effect in the natural or physical world, there is a natural cause. Yeah, but isn't that the way people typically live their lives? I asked. Are you saying that we should be looking for supernatural explanations behind everything that takes place? Everyone would agree that you don't appeal to supernatural causes if you don't have to, Boyd said. But these scholars go beyond that and say you don't ever have to. They operate under the assumption that everything in history has happened according to their own experiences. And since they've never seen the supernatural, they assume miracles have never occurred in history. Here's what they do. They rule out the possibility of the supernatural from the beginning, and then they say, now, bring on the evidence about Jesus. No wonder they get the results they do. I wanted to turn the tables a bit. All right, then, how would you proceed? I asked. I would grant that you shouldn't appeal to the supernatural until you have to. Yes, first look for a natural explanation. I do that in my own life. A tree falls. Okay, maybe there were termites. Now, could an angel have pushed it over? Well, I wouldn't go to that conclusion until there was some definite evidence for it. So I grant that. But what I can't grant is the tremendous presumption that we know enough about the universe to say that God, if there is a God, can never break into our world in a supernatural way. That's a very presumptuous assumption. That's not a presumption based on history. Now you're doing metaphysics. I think there should be a certain amount of humility in the historical investigation to say, you know what? It is just possible that Jesus Christ did rise from the dead. It's just possible that his disciples actually saw what the Gospels say they saw. And if there's no other way of accounting adequately for the evidence, let's investigate that possibility. That, I think, is the only way to give the evidence a fair hearing. To come up with their conclusion that Jesus never spoke most of the words in the Gospels, members of the Jesus Seminar use their own set of assumptions and criteria. But are these standards reasonable and appropriate? Or were they loaded from the outset, like dice that are weighted so that they yield the result that was desired all along? There are multiple problems with their assumptions and criteria, Boyd began in analyzing the group's approach. For instance, they assume that the later church put these sayings into the mouth of Jesus, unless they have good evidence to think otherwise. That assumption is rooted in their suspicion of the Gospels, and that comes from their assumption that the supernatural can't occur. Historians usually operate with the burden of proof on the historian to prove falsity or unreliability, since people are generally not compulsive liars. Without that assumption, we know very little about ancient history. The Jesus Seminar turns this on its head and says you've got to affirmatively prove that a saying came from Jesus. Then they come up with questionable criteria to do that. Now, it's okay for scholars to use appropriate criteria in considering whether Jesus said something. But I'm against the idea that if Jesus doesn't meet these criteria, he must not have said it. That kind of negative conclusion can be a problem. Dealing in this theoretical realm was starting to bring more murkiness than clarity for me. I needed some concrete examples so I could follow Boyd's point. Talk about some of the specific criteria they used, I said. One is called double dissimilarity, he replied. This means they can believe Jesus said something if it doesn't look like something a rabbi or a later church would say. Otherwise, they assume it got into the Gospels from a Jewish or Christian source. The obvious problem is that Jesus was Jewish, and he founded the Christian church. So it shouldn't be surprising if he sounds Jewish and Christian. Yet they've applied this criterion to reach the negative conclusion that Jesus didn't say a whole lot. Then there's the criterion of multiple attestation, which means we can only be sure Jesus said something if it's found in more than one source. Now, this can be a helpful test in confirming a saying. However, why argue in the other direction? If it's only found in one source, it's not valid. In fact, most of ancient history is based on single sources. Generally, if a source is considered reliable, and I would argue that there are plenty of reasons to believe that the Gospels are reliable, it should be considered credible, even if it can't be confirmed by other sources. Even when Jesus' sayings are found in 2 or 3 Gospels, they don't consider this as passing the multiple attestation criterion. If a saying is found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they consider that only one source, because they assume that Matthew and Luke used Mark in writing their Gospels. They're failing to recognize that an increasing number of scholars are expressing serious reservations about the theory that Matthew and Luke used Mark. With this line of thinking, you can see why it's extremely difficult to prove multiple attestation. Boyd started to go on, but I told him he had already made his point. Loaded criteria, like weighted dice, inevitably bring the results that were desired from the beginning. One approach taken by naturalistic scholars has been to look for parallels between Jesus and others from ancient history as a way of demonstrating that his claims and deeds were not completely unique. Their goal is to explain away the view that Jesus was one